On the morning of September 11th, 1999, at approximately 9:30 a.m., journalists and camera crews gathered outside a modest, semi-detached house on Garden Avenue in the South London suburb of Bexley Heath. The house, built sometime in the 1930s, sat on a quiet residential street lined with similar properties: neat front gardens, bay windows, small driveways. Number 34 was distinguished only by its well-tended rose bushes and a blue front door that needed repainting. The woman who answered was 87 years old, white-haired, wearing a cardigan over a floral dress. Her name was Melita Norwood. Until that morning, her neighbors had known her as a retired secretary who gardened and attended Communist Party meetings. What they did not know was that she had been one of the most effective Soviet spies in British history. The media attention that September morning had been triggered by information contained in a book published just days earlier. The Mitrokhin archive, written by historian Christopher Andrew, based on documents smuggled out of Russia in 1992 by Vasily Mitrokhin, a former senior archivist in the KGB's Foreign Intelligence Directorate, had identified Norwood by her KGB codename. Quote 1. The book revealed that she had provided the Soviet Union with classified information about British atomic research from the late 1930s through the early 1970s, that she had done so voluntarily and without significant payment, and that British intelligence services had been aware of her identity since 1993, but had decided not to prosecute her due to her advanced age and the passage of time. When the reporters asked Melita Norwood if the allegations were true, she confirmed them without hesitation. She told a BBC journalist that morning she showed no remorse and expressed no regret. She believed, she said, that she had helped to maintain the balance of power during the Cold War and had thereby contributed to peace. Before we continue, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these forgotten cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. The revelation shocked Britain. Here was an elderly woman who had lived what appeared to be an unremarkable life in suburban London, who had worked for decades in what seemed to be a mundane administrative position, who had raised a family and tended her garden, and who had simultaneously been engaged in espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union during some of the most critical years of the 20th century. The case raised uncomfortable questions about security, about ideology, about the nature of betrayal, and about how someone could maintain such a profound double existence for so long without detection. Melita Norwood had been born Melita Cernis on March 25, 1912, in Bournemouth, a seaside town on England's south coast. Her father, Alexander Cernis, was a Latvian immigrant who had fled to England in 1903 to escape political persecution by the Tsarist regime. He was a dedicated socialist who had been involved in revolutionary activities in Latvia and who brought those convictions with him to Britain. Her mother, Gertrude, was English, a schoolteacher who shared many of her husband's political views. Melita grew up in a household where political discussion was constant and where socialism and later communism were presented not as abstract ideologies, but as moral imperatives. Alexander Cernis died when Melita was only 6 years old in 1918 during the influenza pandemic that killed millions worldwide. His death left Gertrude to raise Melita and her siblings alone, but it did not diminish the political atmosphere of the household. Gertrude remained devoted to left-wing causes and ensured her children understood the importance of social justice, workers' rights, and international solidarity. Melita attended Itchen School in Southampton, a local secondary school where she proved to be an academically capable student with particular aptitude in languages. After completing her secondary education in 1930, at the age of 18, she attended Southampton University for a year, studying Latin and logic. However, financial constraints made it difficult for her to continue her university education, and she left after 1 year to seek employment. In 1932, at the age of 20, Melita moved to London and found work as a secretary with the Independent Labour Party, a left-wing political organization. This was not simply employment, but an expression of her political convictions. The early 1930s in Britain were years of economic depression, mass unemployment, political polarization, and growing fears about the rise of fascism in Europe. For many young people on the left, particularly those from backgrounds like Melita's, politics was not an academic exercise but a matter of urgent moral importance. It was during this period that Melita became actively involved in communist circles. In 1934, she joined the Communist Party of Great Britain. The party, while small, attracted intellectuals, workers, and activists who believed that capitalism had failed and that the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope for creating a just and equitable society. The party organized study groups, political meetings, demonstrations, and cultural activities. It provided a community of like-minded individuals who shared a vision of revolutionary change. Melita would remain a party member for the rest of her life, never concealing her membership even when it became professionally risky to maintain such affiliations. In 1935, Melita married Hilary Nussbaum, a fellow communist whom she had met through party activities. Hilary, whose family had anglicized their surname to Norwood, was a teacher and a committed Marxist. The couple settled in South London, where they would spend the rest of their lives. They had one daughter, Anita, born in 1943. By all accounts, the Norwood marriage was stable and companionate, built on shared political convictions as much as romantic affection. In 1937, at the age of 25, Melita Norwood obtained a position as a secretary with the British Non-Ferrous Metals Research Association, known by its acronym BN-FMRA. The organization, based in Euston, North London, conducted research on metals and metallurgy on behalf of British industry and, increasingly as the 1930s progressed, for military applications. The position seemed unremarkable: secretarial work in a research organization, typing correspondence, filing documents, organizing meetings. It was precisely the kind of employment that would attract little attention or scrutiny. What made the position significant was that BN-FMRA, despite its innocuous name, became deeply involved in research related to what would become Britain's atomic weapons program. As international tensions increased in the late 1930s, and particularly after the outbreak of World War II in September 1939, British scientists and the government became increasingly interested in the potential military applications of atomic energy. Research into nuclear fission, the process by which atomic nuclei split and release enormous amounts of energy, was being conducted at universities and research institutions across Britain. Much of this research involved questions about which materials could be used in atomic weapons and reactors, questions that fell directly within BN-FMRA's area of expertise. Melita Norwood's position as a secretary gave her access to documents, correspondence, and research findings that passed through the organization. Secretaries in research institutions handle classified materials, type confidential reports, maintain filing systems, and often know more about what projects are underway than anyone outside the immediate research teams. She was not a scientist and could not fully understand the technical implications of the documents she handled, but she had access to the documentation of that research, and that access made her valuable to Soviet intelligence. According to documents from the Mitrokhin archive and subsequent historical research, Melita Norwood was first approached by Soviet intelligence in 1937, shortly after she began working at BN-FMRA. The approach was made not by a Soviet intelligence officer operating under diplomatic cover, but through her connections in the Communist Party. Soviet intelligence during this period relied heavily on what were called, quote, four. Communist Party members who identified individuals with access to valuable information and who might be willing to cooperate with the Soviet Union. The recruitment process appears to have been relatively straightforward. Norwood was already ideologically devoted to communism. She believed in the Soviet Union as a progressive force in world affairs. She viewed capitalism as exploitative and imperialistic. When approached and asked if she would be willing to provide information to help the Soviet Union, she agreed. There was no coercion, no blackmail, no significant financial incentive. She simply believed it was the right thing to do. This ideological conviction, formed in the political crucible of the 1930s, would sustain her espionage activities for nearly 4 decades. The tradecraft Norwood employed was notably simple and low risk. She did not engage in elaborate dead drops, clandestine meetings in dark parks, or coded communications. Her method was straightforward. She removed documents from BN-FMRA, took them home, and photographed them using a camera provided by her handlers. She then passed the film to Soviet intelligence at meetings whose exact locations were not documented in available MI5 files, though Mitrokhin's notes suggest they occurred at cafes and public spaces in London. After each meeting, she would return the original documents to BN-FMRA's files the following day. This approach was effective precisely because of its simplicity. Elaborate espionage techniques attract attention and create opportunities for detection. Norwood's method required no specialized equipment beyond a camera, no suspicious behavior, no unusual contacts. She was a secretary doing secretarial work, occasionally taking documents home to finish tasks in the evening or over the weekend, a practice that, while technically a security violation, was common enough that it raised no alarms. The information Norwood provided to Soviet intelligence during World War II and the immediate post-war period was significant. Between 1937 and 1950, as Britain and the United States pursued the development of atomic weapons, a program that would culminate in the American Manhattan Project, British research institutions, including BN-FMRA, were involved in solving metallurgical problems related to uranium enrichment, plutonium production, and reactor design. According to declassified MI5 assessments, Norwood photographed documents that included research findings on uranium tube alloy processing, specifications for reactor materials, and analyses of various metal alloys for use in atomic research. The exact nature of some materials she passed remains partially classified, though MI5 confirmed they related directly to Britain's atomic weapons program. The value of this information proved substantial. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb on August 29, 1949, at the Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan, years earlier than Western intelligence agencies had predicted. While Soviet scientists were certainly capable of developing atomic weapons independently, espionage shortened their timeline significantly. Information from British and American sources, including from Norwood and from other spies, such as Klaus Fuchs, who worked directly on the Manhattan Project and who was arrested in 1950, gave Soviet researchers insights into specific technical challenges and solutions, allowing them to avoid dead ends and accelerate their program. Norwood's significance should not be overstated. She was one source among several that Soviet intelligence relied upon for atomic research information. Klaus Fuchs, for instance, provided far more sensitive information because he worked directly on weapons design, but Norwood was a consistent, reliable, and long-term source who provided valuable intelligence over an extended period, and unlike Fuchs, she was never caught during her active years. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, as the Cold War intensified and as Western intelligence services became increasingly focused on identifying and neutralizing Soviet espionage networks, Norwood continued her activities undetected. Several factors contributed to her ability to avoid detection, and chief among them was the nature of her position and her gender. She was a woman working in a secretarial role, and security services of the era focused their attention primarily on male scientists and officials rather than on administrative staff. This gender bias created a significant blind spot. Secretaries had access to classified information, but were often not subjected to the same level of scrutiny as the scientists and officials they supported. Security vetting procedures of the era concentrated on scientists, officials, and military personnel, while paying far less attention to administrative staff, particularly women. She also maintained an entirely conventional outward existence. She went to work each day, did her job competently, came home to her husband and daughter, tended her garden, and engaged in community activities. She was not a heavy drinker, did not display unexplained wealth, did not travel to unusual places, and did not associate openly with known foreign intelligence officers. She lived in the same house in South London for decades, raised her daughter, attended Parent-Teacher Association meetings, and shopped at the local cooperative grocery store. The ordinariness of her daily life provided perfect cover for her espionage activities. The 1950s and 1960s were decades of heightened security consciousness in Britain. The exposure of the Cambridge Five, a group of British intelligence officers and officials who had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in the 1930s and who had provided classified information to Moscow for years, created intense scrutiny of anyone with left-wing political associations. Several major espionage cases, including the arrest of Klaus Fuchs in February 1950, led to comprehensive security reviews and increased vetting procedures for anyone with access to classified information. Melita Norwood was questioned on at least one occasion in the early 1950s about her political affiliations, as were many Communist Party members employed in sensitive positions. She acknowledged her party membership and her left-wing views, but denied any involvement in espionage. The interview did not result in any action being taken against her. She continued working at BN-FMRA, and she continued passing information to Soviet intelligence. The question of why her Communist Party membership did not disqualify her from sensitive work reveals much about the security culture of the era. Communist Party membership was legal in Britain and relatively common among left-wing intellectuals and activists during the 1930s through the 1960s. While it might have been grounds for denial of employment in the most sensitive positions, particularly after the security scares of the 1950s, it was not in itself proof of espionage. Many Communist Party members were loyal British citizens who never engaged in illegal activities on behalf of the Soviet Union. The challenge for security services was distinguishing between those who were simply political activists and those who were actual intelligence assets. In Norwood's case, that distinction was never made during her active years. Throughout the 1960s, Norwood continued her work at BN-FMRA and her espionage activities, though the nature of both evolved. By the mid-1960s, Britain's atomic weapons program had matured, and much of the cutting-edge research had been consolidated under other government agencies and research institutions. BN-FMRA remained involved in metallurgical research, but was less central to weapons development than it had been in the 1940s. The value of information Norwood could provide diminished accordingly. Her last documented contact with Soviet intelligence appears to have occurred around 1972, though the exact date is unclear from available sources. By this time, she was 60 years old and approaching retirement. The risk-to-reward calculation for both Norwood and her Soviet handlers would have shifted. She had less access to valuable current information, and the risk of discovery, which would compromise not just her but potentially other Soviet assets and operations, may have seemed less justifiable. In 1972, Melita Norwood retired from BN-FMRA at the age of 60. She had worked there for 35 years. She received a standard retirement send-off, colleagues gave speeches acknowledging her dedication and efficiency, and she left with a pension, and no suspicion that she had been anything other than a loyal and competent employee. Her colleagues described her as quiet, efficient, and reliable. None suspected that she had been photographing classified documents and passing them to Soviet intelligence for most of her career. Retirement did not mean the end of Melita Norwood's political activities. She remained an active member of the Communist Party of Great Britain throughout the 1970s and 1980s, a period when the party's membership and influence declined dramatically. As revelations about Soviet repression, human rights abuses, and economic failures became increasingly difficult to ignore, many British communists abandoned the party or revised their views. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the suppression of dissidents, the publication of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's _5_ detailing the Soviet labor camp system, all of these created crises of faith for Western communists. Norwood held fast to the principles she had embraced in the 1930s, convinced that despite its flaws, the Soviet system represented humanity's best hope for social justice. She attended party meetings, participated in study groups, and supported various left-wing causes. She campaigned against nuclear weapons, against British involvement in NATO, and in favor of better relations with the Soviet Union. To her neighbors and acquaintances, she was simply an elderly left-wing activist, earnest and idealistic but harmless. Melita's daughter, Anita, grew up aware of her parents' political convictions, but entirely unaware of her mother's espionage. Anita herself became politically active, becoming involved in campaigns for nuclear disarmament and later in environmental activism. She married and had children of her own. The Norwood family remained close, gathering for holidays and family occasions, maintaining what appeared to be a typical British family life with left-wing political views, but no extraordinary secrets. Throughout the 1980s, as the Soviet Union entered its final decade under Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, British and American intelligence agencies continued to investigate historical espionage cases. Then, in 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Vasily Mitrokhin defected to Britain. Mitrokhin, who had worked as a senior archivist for the KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence operations, had spent years secretly copying documents from KGB archives. When he retired in 1984, he had smuggled his notes out of KGB headquarters piece by piece, eventually accumulating a vast collection that documented Soviet espionage operations worldwide from the 1930s through the 1980s. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Mitrokhin decided to defect. He first approached the American embassy in Riga, Latvia, but was rebuffed by officials who did not take him seriously. He then approached the British embassy, where intelligence officers recognized the potential value of what he was offering. In 1992, Mitrokhin was exfiltrated to Britain along with his family and his archive of notes. Among the thousands of pages of notes Mitrokhin provided to British intelligence were references to an agent codenamed __, quote, _6__, described as a woman who had worked in a British research institution and who had provided valuable atomic research intelligence to the Soviet Union from the late 1930s through the early 1970s. British intelligence analysts began the process of identifying, quote, 7 by cross-referencing the information in Mitrokhin's notes with personnel records, security files, and other intelligence information. By 1993, investigators had identified Melita Norwood as Hola. The identification was based on matching details in the Mitrokhin notes: her place of employment, the timing of her activities, her Communist Party membership, and other biographical information, with records from BN-FMRA and MI5's own files. MI5 opened a file on Norwood and reviewed what was known about her activities, which until Mitrokhin's defection had been essentially nothing. The question then became what to do with this information. Melita Norwood was 81 years old in 1993, living quietly in Bexley Heath with her husband Hilary, who was in his 80s. She posed no ongoing security threat. She no longer had access to classified information. She was not engaged in any current espionage activities. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union no longer existed. Any prosecution would be of a woman in her 80s for actions taken decades earlier on behalf of a state that had ceased to exist. British intelligence and government officials debated whether prosecution would serve any useful purpose. The Attorney General's office was consulted. The decision, reached in 1993, was not to prosecute. The reasoning was partly practical. The difficulty of obtaining a conviction for crimes committed so long ago, the age and health of the defendant, the limited public interest in punishing an elderly woman for Cold War espionage, and partly strategic. British intelligence agencies wanted to maintain their relationship with Mitrokhin and wanted to continue exploiting the information he had provided without drawing public attention to the source. A public trial might compromise those interests. For the next 6 years, Melita Norwood lived in ignorance of the fact that her espionage had been discovered. She continued her quiet retirement, tending her garden, reading, attending occasional Communist Party meetings, and spending time with her daughter and grandchildren. She had no reason to believe that anyone knew what she had done or that her past would ever be exposed. That changed in September 1999 when Christopher Andrew published __9_Andrew, an official historian of MI5 and a professor at Cambridge University, had been given access to Mitrokhin's notes and had spent years analyzing them and writing a comprehensive account of Soviet espionage operations as documented in KGB archives. The book, published in September 1999, included detailed information about numerous Soviet agents in Western countries, including several previously unknown cases. Among those cases was Hola. Andrew identified Melita Norwood by name, describing her activities and assessing her significance to Soviet atomic espionage. The public disclosure was picked up immediately by British media. Within hours of the book's publication, journalists had identified Norwood's address and had descended on Garden Avenue in Bexley Heath. The media attention was intense and immediate. Reporters camped outside Norwood's house. Television cameras filmed her tending her roses or walking to the local shops. Newspapers ran stories describing her as, quote, 11, a reference to the cooperative grocery store where she shopped and a play on the title of John le Carré's famous spy novel. The tabloid press portrayed her as a treacherous grandmother who had betrayed Britain. The broadsheet press offered more nuanced analysis but still expressed shock at the revelation. Melita Norwood's response was remarkable for its complete lack of contrition. In interviews with reporters on her doorstep, and later in more formal settings, she defended her actions without equivocation. She stated that she had no regrets, that she believed she had acted correctly, and that she would do it again if faced with the same choices. She argued that by providing atomic research information to the Soviet Union, she had helped to prevent the United States from having a monopoly on nuclear weapons, which she believed had contributed to peace by creating a balance of power. This unwavering defense infuriated many commentators and members of the public. Calls for her prosecution were immediate. Conservative members of Parliament demanded that she be charged with espionage. Some argued that regardless of her age, she should be held accountable for her actions. The government's response was cautious. Home Secretary Jack Straw issued a statement confirming that Norwood's espionage had been discovered in 1992 following Mitrokhin's defection, and that a decision had been made not to prosecute. He defended that decision on practical grounds, noting her age and the time that had elapsed since her espionage activities. He also noted that prosecution would have required disclosure of sensitive intelligence sources and methods, potentially compromising ongoing security operations. The Attorney General's office reviewed the decision not to prosecute in light of the public controversy, but concluded that prosecution remained inappropriate. Melita Norwood would not face charges. She was free to continue her life in Bexley Heath, though that life was now under intense public scrutiny. A comprehensive review of how Norwood had avoided detection for so long revealed systemic failures in security procedures. Document security at BN-FMRA and similar organizations in the 1940s through the 1960s had been notably lax by modern standards. Classified documents were often not properly tracked, sign-out procedures were informal or non-existent, and staff members frequently took work home without any record being made. These practices were common across many government and research institutions of the era, reflecting a different security culture than would develop later. The review also confirmed that secretarial staff, particularly women, had been subjected to far less scrutiny than scientists and officials, despite having similar access to classified information. The comparison between Melita Norwood and Klaus Fuchs was instructive. Fuchs, a German-born physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project, provided far more sensitive information to Soviet intelligence than Norwood did. He had direct knowledge of weapons design and had access to America's most closely guarded atomic secrets. He was caught in 1950 and sentenced to 14 years in prison, serving 9 years before being released and moving to East Germany. The difference between Fuchs's capture and Norwood's decades of success was partly a matter of the level of scrutiny to which each was subjected. Fuchs was a scientist working directly on weapons design, and when suspicions arose, he was investigated intensively. Norwood was a secretary handling administrative documents, and even when questions were raised about Communist Party members in sensitive positions, she was questioned only superficially and then cleared. The impact of the revelation on Melita Norwood's family was significant. Her daughter, Anita, found herself confronting the reality that her mother had lived a double life for decades. In interviews, Anita expressed shock at the discovery. She stated that while she had always known her mother was a committed communist, she had never suspected espionage. She described her mother as a kind and gentle person who genuinely believed she was working for peace. Anita defended her mother's character while acknowledging that others might judge her actions differently. The public disclosure thrust Anita into an unwanted spotlight, forcing her to reconcile her childhood memories of a loving mother with the public revelation of long-term espionage. The revelation also affected Norwood's relationships with former colleagues and neighbors. Some expressed feelings of betrayal, particularly those who had worked with her at BN-FMRA and who felt that she had violated their trust. Others were simply bewildered that this woman they had known as a quiet, efficient secretary had been a Soviet spy. A few defended her, arguing that her political convictions, however misguided, had been sincere, and that she should not be vilified for actions taken in a different era under different circumstances. Melita Norwood lived for 6 more years after her identity became public. She continued to reside in the house on Garden Avenue, though the media attention eventually faded and she returned to a quieter life. She remained a member of the Communist Party until her death and continued to believe in the causes she had supported throughout her life. She gave occasional interviews to historians and journalists interested in Cold War espionage, consistently maintaining that she had acted correctly and stood by her decisions. She died on June 2, 2005, at the age of 93. Her death was reported in major British newspapers, which noted her espionage activities and her significance to Soviet atomic intelligence. Obituaries described her as one of the most effective Soviet agents in British history and noted the paradox of her conventional outward life and her secret activities. Some obituaries attempted to assess her legacy, with opinions divided between those who saw her as a traitor and those who saw her as an idealist who had acted according to her convictions. Hilary Norwood, her husband, had died in 1986, 13 years before his wife's espionage became public knowledge. Whether he was aware of her activities remains uncertain. Some accounts suggest that he may have known and tacitly approved, given his own communist convictions, but there is no documentary evidence to confirm this. If he did know, he took that knowledge to his grave, never discussing it publicly and apparently never being investigated himself by MI5. The question of Melita Norwood's legacy is complicated and cannot be reduced to simple judgments. From a purely intelligence history perspective, she was a significant source who provided valuable information to Soviet intelligence over an extended period. She demonstrated that effective espionage does not require elaborate tradecraft or dramatic operations, but can be accomplished through patient, methodical work by individuals with access and ideological conviction. From a moral perspective, assessments vary widely. Some view her as a traitor who betrayed her country for an ideology, who helped a totalitarian regime develop weapons that threatened Britain, and who violated her legal obligations and the trust of her colleagues. Others see her as an idealist who genuinely believed she was working for peace, who acted according to her understanding of right and wrong, even when it conflicted with the law, and whose dedication to her principles, however misguided those principles might have been, represented a kind of integrity. The question of whether Melita Norwood's espionage actually contributed to peace was and remains impossible to answer definitively. The Soviet Union would likely have developed atomic weapons eventually, even without the assistance of Norwood and other spies, though the timeline would have been longer. Whether the existence of Soviet atomic weapons prevented war through mutually assured destruction or simply made the Cold War more dangerous is a question that historians and strategists continue to debate. The Cold War involved numerous proxy conflicts, arms races, and moments of crisis, including the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 that brought the world close to nuclear war. Whether Norwood's contribution to Soviet atomic capability made such crises more or less likely to escalate is unknowable. What is certain is that Melita Norwood made choices that had consequences extending far beyond her own life. She chose to commit espionage based on ideological convictions formed in the 1930s. She chose to sustain that activity for nearly 40 years. She chose to prioritize what she believed was a higher loyalty to international socialism and peace over her obligations to her country and her employer. She owned those choices and bore responsibility for them, but she made them in a world divided by ideological conflict, in a society that classified enormous amounts of information while relying on imperfect systems to protect it, in a political environment where Communist Party membership was legal and where many genuinely believed the Soviet Union represented progress, and within a security culture that systematically underestimated women in clerical positions. Those systemic factors did not cause her choices, but they created conditions in which those choices became possible and, from her perspective, morally necessary. The public disclosure of Melita Norwood in 1999 occurred in a dramatically different world from the one in which she had committed espionage. The Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The opening of Soviet archives had confirmed the scale of Stalin's purges and the regime's systematic violations of human rights. The populations of former Soviet states had, with few exceptions, embraced independence and democratic reforms. In this context, Norwood's unwavering dedication to communism seemed to many like clinging to beliefs that history had proven catastrophically wrong. But to dismiss her case as simply historical curiosity would be to miss what it reveals about ideology's power to motivate human behavior, about individuals' capacity to maintain profound secrets across lifetimes, about security systems' failures to protect classified information, and about the complex questions of loyalty and morality that arise in conditions of ideological conflict. Melita Norwood was neither a monster nor a hero. She was a secretary who helped the Soviet Union develop atomic weapons. She was a grandmother who tended roses and committed espionage. She was a communist believer who never wavered even when confronted with overwhelming evidence of the Soviet system's failures. She was ordinary in almost every visible aspect of her life, and that ordinariness was precisely what made her effective as a spy. The photograph that appeared in newspapers in September 1999, an elderly woman in a cardigan, white-haired, looking like anyone's grandmother, contradicted public expectations of what a Soviet spy should look like, a disconnect that helps explain her decades of success. Melita Norwood was 25 years old when she began passing information to Soviet intelligence in 1937. She was 60 when she retired from BN-FMRA in 1972, and her espionage activities apparently ended. She was 87 when her activities became known in 1999. She was 93 when she died in 2005, having spent the last 6 years of her life as a publicly identified spy who stood by her decisions without apology. And in between those moments, she lived a life that appeared entirely conventional, working, raising a family, tending a garden, attending political meetings, while simultaneously engaged in one of the longest-running espionage operations of the Cold War, hidden in plain sight for more than half a century.